After battling cancer for 2 years, Hugo Chavez, one of Latin America's most famous leaders, dead at the age of 58. What is his legacy? What is next for that country? Already Obama, Stephen Harper, all sorts of messages coming in and comments on the death of Hugo Chavez. Let's get more on the fallout from Janice Stein, the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs. She's with me in Toronto. In Washington, Cliff May, the president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. Both of you, thanks for being here. Janice Stein, let me start with you. Hugo Chavez's political legacy, what would you say it is?
Well, you know, Evan, he led a group of Latin American governments who were determined to restrict the influence of the United States, to come out from under the American umbrella, to exploit their natural resources, to fundamentally restructure the programs that went to the poor, he and Evo Morales. But this was a highly personal movement. There was almost a cult of personality around Hugo Chavez, and what survives them is open to question.
Cliff May, from Washington, the perspective will be very interesting. He had very, very open battles with Washington, with George W. Bush. He had open courtship of the regime in Iran. What's the reaction in Washington?
Well, it depends where you stand, but I think generally speaking, Chavez was seen as someone who was anti-American, who was trying to lead Latin America in an anti-American direction, who was very cozy with the regime in Tehran, flights going back and forth constantly between Venezuela and Iran, and not clear who or what was in those planes. He has used the oil wealth, and by the way, he sells a lot of his oil, did sell a lot of his oil to the U.S., about I don't know, $34 billion, I think, the U.S. paid in 2012. And then he uses that oil both at home, not to take people out of poverty, but to keep people more comfortable in their poverty, I would argue. And also he sells oil more cheaply in Latin America and the Caribbean. I think he's trying to buy favor, buy loyalty from various folks. And I think he's also been involved with Iran, with bad guys in Syria, and a lot of the world. He sees himself as a socialist revolutionary, and he is aligning himself with Islamic revolutionaries such as in Iran as well, to the detriment of the United States and American allies around the world.
Certainly, Janice, he stood up as a resistor to American influence in the region. There's no question. Nonetheless, it was one of these strange relationships because the U.S. still bought Venezuelan oil. The billions of dollars they fed Venezuela supported Chavez, who nationalized certain industries. What happens now in terms of that relationship?
Well, that's the big question. Evan, first of all, the Venezuelan oil industry is really not in good shape. It's undercapitalized. There hasn't been a lot of reinvestment in technology. So this really has been a case of selling a resource and using the revenues. I don't quite agree with Cliff that it kept people in poverty. When you actually look, and you will see this in the streets now, he mobilized the poor in Venezuela in a broad-based social movement, which is what gave him election victory after election victory, as well as the fact, by the way, that he intimidated the press and he intimidated the legislature and the courts. So it's a really mixed record. The United States was his biggest customer, and U.S. money went into supporting this movement, frankly.
Jess, let me just stay with you for a minute before I bring Cliff in. I want to get specifically a Canadian read on the situation. John Baird, our Foreign Affairs Minister, was supposed to recently be heading to Venezuela. That meeting was canceled by the Venezuelans. Earlier, by the way, we said it was canceled by Mr. Baird. It wasn't when we were speaking to Jean Chrétien, so I want to clarify that. It was canceled by the Venezuelans. Why was Mr. Baird interested in going to Venezuela? Just give us a sense of the Canadian-Venezuelan relationship.
You know, I think, Evan, our Minister of Foreign Affairs feels very strongly that this is a turning point in the history of the region. Cuba is another target of interest because we see the government changing, evolving. I think there was a sense, and I think rightly so, that in Venezuela, given Hugo Chavez's illness, this is a hinge moment, and the future of the country is far more open than it's been for the last 14 years, so that this really was the time for Canada to make its presence felt and to see if it can invest in a more open and engaged Latin America. That really is the strategy.
A hinge moment is an interesting term. Cliff May, now what happens? We talk about a cult of personality, which really very much surrounded Hugo Chavez. Now, of course, the vice president, Nicolas Maduro, who announced the death of Hugo Chavez, has just released a statement saying, in this historic tragedy, we call on the men and women to be vigilant for peace and respect for the nation. Civilians and military assume his legacy, his challenges, his project, together with the accompaniment and support of the people. They put flags at half-mast. The opposition has also, in Venezuela, sent their condolences. What happens now in Venezuela? Is this a hinge moment vis-a-vis their relationship with the U.S.?
It's a hinge moment in many ways. First of all, we'll see if the succession is peaceful and orderly or not. What's supposed to happen is that the head of the Congress becomes the interim president. There's supposed to be new elections within, I believe it's 30 days. Nicolas Maduro, as you say, is the one who is the sort of successor that has been anointed by Chavez. It is not clear that he has the support that Chavez enjoyed, and that he can continue the Chavez Bolivarian revolution, as it were, or whether he'll be challenged by the opposition and there'll be a very different turn. Now, Maduro, I'm sure, would like to take Chavez's place and fill his shoes. I think it's very hard to predict whether that's going to happen or not, and also whether the election will be free and fair, and people will see it that way, and whether the opposition will have a chance to mount a real campaign.
You know, just on this point, Cliff, one of the really interesting provisions of the Constitution is the election has to take place in 30 days. That's a very short time between now and the election. First of all, there's an emotional overlay that will follow the funeral. Second of all, Enriquez Capriles, who will probably be the opposition candidate, he's a seasoned campaigner, but he's lost outside his own government. So there's a real challenge within this very short period of time to put in place the political organization that will be necessary to challenge Maduro.
I've got about a minute and a half. Cliff May, one of the geopolitical elements here is what happens to these movements. I mean, Chavez very much was the legacy of people like Fidel Castro, and there's a long legacy of the socialist movement and the left movement in Latin America and the role that played. And of course, there's always that whipsaw, we've talked about this in the program, to the far right in certain countries, and it sort of goes back and forth. What does this mean for the sort of the Castro-Chavez legacy of that political ideology?
Yeah. Well, the question is who's going to lead that movement. I don't think that movement is going to quite dissolve, but you've always had a caudillo, a strong man. And if you think about it, Chavez was that, and he actually has used Venezuelan oil also to prop up what's left of the Castro regime in Cuba. That relationship also will be interesting to see how that unfolds and what takes place. I would imagine that Maduro will want to continue that. I think Janice is quite right that Maduro is favored because there will be sympathy for Chavez that will go to Maduro, and because it'll be hard for the opposition to fight, and it's not an entirely free country. But I think that movement is up for grabs to an extent.
Janice Stein, Director of the Munk School of Global Affairs, and Cliff May, President of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. Your reaction to the death of Hugo Chavez very much welcome as we all try to figure out what comes next in the country of Venezuela. A very important country, obviously, geopolitically, because of the power they wield from their oil. Thanks to both of you.